Hello, everybody. Welcome to the latest edition of the Pulse with BP. I'm your host, Billy Parvatam. Folks, I'm so excited today to be joined by Mr. Steve Jones, the voice of Penn State football and men's basketball in some capacity since 1982. He's been there for a long time, and we're really glad to have him join us today. Mr. Jones, thank you so much for joining me today.
Billy, it's great to be with you.
Well, I want to start off with first, how have you been handling this pandemic? I mean, this is something that has affected our lives both professionally and personally the last year. So how have you been handling this last year?
Well, I think like everybody else, you have to make some adjustments. Now, ironically, basketball, we did everything in the Big Ten remotely in terms of the road games, except going to Virginia Tech. So I was in Castle Coliseum back in December, drove down for that one. We weren't allowed to travel with the team. We had to do Big Ten games remotely. I'm talking about road games, obviously the home games. So we were able to do it in our own broadcast booth. And so you have to make an adjustment there, trying to call it off video feeds and so forth. Football, we did everything live. So I went to Nebraska, I went to Michigan, I went to Rutgers. We travel all over the place. Indiana, we did that on the road as well. So we were able to do that, but it's not a question of whether you appreciate it. I always appreciated being there, so that was never an issue. So I'd always sit there and go, boy, it's great that we're here. I've had some people say, boy, I really appreciate going on the road now. It's like, you do now? I said, well, you didn't appreciate it before? What are you, crazy? So you do have to make some adjustments along the way, but the quicker we get back to normal on that, the better, because it's much better, not just for us, but I think more importantly, it's much better for the audience, because we can see things and give them a perspective when we're actually there, as opposed to trying to call it off TV.
How did this opportunity come up to call games at Penn State?
For me, well, I'm a graduate of Penn State, and when I got out of college, you have to catch, look, Billy, you have to catch breaks along the way. I mean, that's really one of the keys to this whole thing. What kind of break do you catch? And it turned out that I was able to do my first game on the Penn State network at the ripe old age of 23, because Penn State was playing Pitt in football, and it was one of the more famous Penn State games ever. Pitt was ranked number one. They had Dan Marino. Pitt jumped out to a 14-0 lead. Penn State scored 48 unanswered points and won 48-14. Well, the two guys that were doing football were also doing basketball at the time. Well, there was a basketball game that night. Well, they couldn't get back in time to do the basketball game, so they asked me to fill in. Then I filled in later on another game that year, believe it or not, with Nebraska of all teams. And one of the guys decided to retire at the end of the year and call it quits. Well, that opened the door for me, because I was in the right place at the right time to suddenly be on the basketball network. And then when they changed the football network up the next fall, they discovered they needed a third person. Well, since I was already doing basketball, right place, right time, I ended up being a part of the football network as the third announcer. And as time went, I finally was able to get the big opportunity where I was able to get the football job. And but it's more than just the simple break of getting the job. There's also a break as to who you work with. So I've always told people the biggest break I ever got was, obviously getting on the Penn State network, but then getting the football job, which brings it with it, obviously, a prestige to it. But the next one was that they paired me with Jack Ham. Now suddenly I'm sitting next to a Hall of Famer, a legend, a guy that is also at the same time an outstanding broadcaster. And I was always told coming up, my father always told me this. He says, always desire to work with people who make you better. Now, in turn, it's also your responsibility to do whatever you can to make them better too. So then you work in tandem and in partnership. And I've really had the best of both worlds in the last 17 years, because I've had Jack Ham on football, and I've had Dick Girardi on basketball, two Hall of Famers to work side by side with. And, it's made me better along the way. We can now debate if I've made them better at all.
Well, I wanted to ask you, what are some of your favorite memories behind the mic for Penn State?
Oh, it's interesting. You're actually the first person that's phrased it right. because I always get, what was the greatest game? And you phrased it memories, which means it's open-ended. When you've had a long career and you're fortunate to have a long career, now they all start getting lumped together. You have not just one, but you have a bunch of them. And so I'll start with basketball. In basketball, Penn State was able to win the Atlantic 10 Tournament Championship in 1991. It was Penn State's last year in the Atlantic 10. They actually wanted to kick them out because they were going to the Big Ten. And by one vote, they were allowed to stay in. And then they end up going to the championship game, and they beat George Washington and won it. And that followed by going to the NCAA tournament with an automatic bid. And they went to the Carrier Dome, and they beat UCLA, which was the number 4 seed in the Carrier Dome. That really, for me, basketball-wise, I started thinking, wow, okay, this is fun. This is great. Then you start getting into other games. For example, in 2001, Penn State went to the NCAA tournament. They beat Providence in the opening round of the Superdome, but then beat North Carolina to get to the Sweet 16. And that was the first time Penn State had been in the Sweet 16 since 1955. And it was incredible because we were on the bus in the Superdome. We're going to go back to State College. And one of the players had a big bulky phone, which now today we take cell phones for granted. Well, it was 2001. And he looks at everybody and says, "Hey, you won't believe this. There are people in the streets over basketball." And the leading scorer for North Carolina in that game was Julius Peppers.
Wow.
All right, Julius Peppers. And Penn State won the game by 8. And then in 2009, they won the NIT. In 2018, they won the NIT, which were great memories. And of course, a year ago, they won 21 games. They went on an 8-game winning streak where they were beating everybody. Let's go to Purdue, win. Let's go to Michigan State, they win. And that was that 8-game winning streak brought with it great memories. Football-wise, Larry Johnson going over 2,000 yards. He needed 264 yards to get to 2,000 in the final regular season game. He got 279 in the first half. Right. Announcing Joe Paterno's 324 to break Bear Bryant's record. Announcing Joe's 400. Announcing Joe's 409 along the way. The Orange Bowl that went triple overtime with Florida State. A couple big wins over Ohio State, 2005, 2008. Obviously, the 2016 season where Penn State, beat Ohio State. And it's the only time in the history of Penn State football, the only time, 134 years, where they blocked a field goal and ran it back for a touchdown. And that was the winning play of the game with about 4:27 to go in the game. Marcus Allen blocked it, and Grant Haley ran it back for a touchdown. Broadcasting Rose Bowls, Cotton Bowls, Fiesta Bowls. I mean, there's just a lot of great moments along the way. Just at every single game, Billy, I don't care whether it's football or basketball, there'll be a moment. It'll be in a commercial break. It won't be during the game. But I'll look around and think to myself, I'm really fortunate I got to do this. I mean, every single game I do that.
And you get to call games in one of the most iconic stadiums in all of college football, Beaver Stadium at 106,000 capacity, one of the biggest in the country. What is it like to call games there?
Oh, it's fabulous. I love it. First of all, you feel like you have the best seat in the house. We're about the 40, 45-yard line. I'm thinking this is a pretty good seat. And you get to sit there and talk football with Jack Ham for about 5 hours, which is really cool. And when the place is filled, and that's most of the time, and it's rocking. I remember one time in 2005, and the fans are all jumping up and down. It was the Ohio State game, and the press box started to shake. And Jack looks over at me and he says, are we safe up here? And I said, I'm an announcer, not an engineer. No clue. I said, I'm not leaving. So it is really a great experience when you have the whiteouts, the stripe outs, and anything. Anytime there's a big game in there, it is really fabulous. And that's one of the things you talk about at the beginning about adjustments to the pandemic. You have no idea how much I wanted to call a game at Lane Stadium. And I've been in Lane Stadium before. It's not like I haven't been there, but I hadn't called a game in there, and I couldn't wait to go in there. I remember walking in December to Castle, and looking over at Lane thinking, it was a missed opportunity. Because, I mean, Lane stated it, and that game would have been at night, and that would have been wild to be in Blacksburg, for a night game there. It would be, that's one of those lost opportunities. I don't know if we're ever going to make it up.
Yeah, that is unfortunate. I wanted to ask you, too, because you work with one of the best coaches in the country in James Franklin. You get to see him in more personal settings where people like me in the national media don't get to see him in. How do you describe Coach Franklin in more personal settings?
He's a great guy. He really is. He's the kind of guy that'll give you the shirt off his back. He's extremely loyal. He is, people say he's a player's coach. That's great, because I think, look, you have to be in today's coaching, Billy, you have to be the 2 Ds. You have to be demanding without being demeaning. And that's about where you are today. Well, he's demanding, he pushes, he disciplines. And the second they make a play, he's the first guy sprinting down the practice field, jumping in the air, chest bumping, hip bumping. He's a very enthusiastic, positive person who, at the same time, when he has to discipline, he'll discipline. But he'll discipline in a way. In other words, not calling you out in front of everybody. He'll just say, look, and he says, my office later. And then, and they'll meet out whatever it happens to be. But he's a great guy for those guys to play for. For me personally, he's about as easy to work with as anybody in the face of the earth. He is, anytime I need something, and I don't ask for much. I mean, that's the other part too. You have to be smart about what you ask for here. Hey, look, hey, we need to do this at this particular time. Great. Okay, we'll work it out between the two of us. And we have a pretty good system between the two of us as to when we do the pregame show. Win, lose, or draw. Well, there's no draws these days, but win or lose, he's always there on the post-game show, and and he doesn't sit there and cut you short. He gives you very thoughtful, intelligent answers. I mean, I really feel like with him as a coach, you're sitting there as an announcer, and I tell all the other guys, man, I hit the jackpot. I mean, I said, my guy's a great guy.
Well, I wanted to ask you about a couple of Penn State figures you've had a chance to cover in your career, whether it's a personal story you can share off the field or maybe a moment on the field. What's your best Saquon Barkley story?
My best Saquon Barkley story. Let's see. Saquon Barkley is a perfectionist. Okay. And he's also extremely thoughtful, and he's very supportive of his teammates. So if somebody makes a big run in a Sunday night scrimmage where he's not participating, he's the first guy sprinting down the field, hugging Jimmy. It's great to see how supportive he is of his teammates. But I remember one night, it was a Sunday night, and they had put him on kickoff return. Okay. And in fact, that year he ran 2 kickoffs back for touchdowns against Indiana and Ohio State. And he goes back, and for whatever reason, for the first time ever, he dropped the kickoff. Okay. Well, you'd have thought that, the world ended. So then he goes back, and the next rep up, when it was his turn, he dropped it again. He stayed after practice just catching kickoffs. I mean, I walked up to him, I said, just so you know, I said, it's Sunday. I said, we're not up to Saturday. He said, I know, Mr. Jones, I know. But that's the way he is. It's always great, Billy, when your best player is your hardest worker. And that is a hallmark of really good teams. I don't care if it's football, basketball, whatever it may be. If your best player is your best worker, which is what he was a monster in the weight room, monster in the track work. Every single rep was all out with him. It sets a tone for everybody else. It makes the entire organization better. And if Trace McSorley had a great game and Saquon had maybe statistically an okay game, all he cared about was winning. So, I mean, that's the kind of guy he was. I mean, he's one of those great guys that you're really glad you ran into during the course of your career for the 3 years he was here. I'll say this. Jack Camp called me up one day, and he said, Saquon had just started there. It was the second day of practice. And he said, So I said, I'm going to be coming up Saturday. He says, just give me an idea, Steve. Who should I look for? I said, man, you ought to see 26. I said, he is something else. I said, he's going to be great.
Did you have any good interactions with Kerry Collins?
Oh, always. Kerry Collins was great. Oh, my goodness. And he was always great to deal with. He's a guy that when he got here, it took him a little bit to win the job. And then midway through the 92 season, he won the job. I remember, though, they went out to BYU, and they lost the game at BYU. But then starting in 93, he just got better and better. And at the end of the year, the end of the 93 season, they lost at They lost at home to Michigan. They lost at Ohio State, believe it or not, in a driving snowstorm on Halloween. I couldn't believe it. I woke up that morning in Columbus. I'm going, it's snowing, and they had grass back then. So and Ohio State never cut the grass. It was like this high. And so they couldn't get anything. At the end of the season, though, he started to really get really good. They played Michigan State, terrific performance. They went to the Citrus Bowl against Tennessee, a terrific performance. Then it set the tone for the next season. He got sacked. Okay, Penn State gave up 5 sacks the entire 94 season, and he was only sacked 3 times. And the offensive line will tell you that it was his fault. But they were up. They're playing USC. They're up 35-0 at halftime. They're playing Iowa. They're up 38-0 at halftime. They're playing Ohio State. Ohio State was ranked 14th in the country. They beat them 63-14. It's the best offense I ever saw in my life. And you know what's great about, you talk about Kerry Collins, Bobby Engram, who won the Blitnikoff Award, he practiced the way he played, right? Kajana Carter was a lot the same way, but I never saw Engram drop a ball in practice, right? Now, Godwin was pretty close to that. Allen Robinson was pretty close to that. And I saw Robinson maybe drop 1 or 2 ever. I may have seen Godwin drop 1 ever, but I never saw Engram drop 1. Right? So, I mean, and so Kerry Collins, yeah, his ability as a quarterback, I mean, he had a little different motion, and he was great to talk to. I mean, he didn't really want to talk too much about himself. He don't want to talk about everybody else. So, well, you got to figure out certain guys. I mean, and so you didn't really ask him too many things about him because he wanted to talk about everybody else, and he gave you great, thoughtful answers about everybody else.
What about one of the most legendary coaches in the history of college football, Joe Paterno?
Can't say enough good things about him. I was around him for 32 years. 32 years. And not one time in 32 years. Now, remember, I mean, all these interviews I had to do with him or personal interaction. He and I never once had a crossword about anything. Zero. Now, if he had a problem with something, right? Sometimes he'd just come over and just talk, confide in, geez, I'm having a problem, whatever, because it wouldn't go anywhere. And we had that trust between us. I mean, and over time, I'll be honest with you, over time, he became a great friend. And I can't say enough great things about working with him, dealing with him, and part of what you do when you stand there is he let me into practice every day. He didn't do that for anybody, but I was able to go every day with the idea that, look, like this is all deep background. I mean, but the trust has to be there, and loyalty was big with him. And he is just somebody that I just stood there and felt like I was learning from the entire time. You can't go to a Penn State football practice and not walk out of there and just not learn from, okay, so this is what he's doing on this day, and this is how he's approaching this day. Same thing with James. I did the same thing with James. I did the same thing with Bill O'Brien, right? Because they all have their different ways, their different ways of going about things, the different systems. You feel like you're trying to learn from them on an everyday basis. And that's the way it was with Joe. I picked up so many different things of not just the X's and O's of football, but how he approached things, the psychology of what he was trying to do out there on the field with his team, how he pushed them or encouraged them. Today they have a clock up that tells you how long the period would go. Joe never had that. He had a little sheet, and in his own mind, okay, you know what, we've done enough. And that's the way he was.
I wanted to ask you, too, you have a chance to travel to some great places in the Big Ten, call games at some great stadiums and atmospheres. What are some of your favorite places to travel in the Big Ten?
Let's see, great places to travel. Well, when you go, for example, to Ohio State, the atmosphere is tremendous. Wisconsin, Camp Randall is really enthusiastic, especially when they do jump around at the end of the third quarter. Remember earlier I was talking about Beaver Stadium's press box shaking. Well, if the stadium is, there's been a couple times Penn State's gone out there and routed them, so the jump around wasn't as effective. But there have been some times with the games in the fourth quarter, and the press box starts rolling a little bit as the students are all doing jump around. So that's a crazy place to be. Nebraska is interesting because it's a loud, enthusiastic crowd. But when the game is over, and the opposing team is walking through the tunnel, so in this case would be Penn State, the fans above the tunnel, even if Penn State wins the game, gives them a standing ovation. I've always thought that was just like a really neat thing. Michigan is interesting because it is huge, obviously 111,000, but it's not that loud. Now the stadium's a little different now, so they've built up on each side luxury suites, and the press box is on one side with suites around it as well. So the noise stays in there better. But until they did that, it's not the 111,000 is intimidating as a number, but in noise, it's not. It's not a very loud stadium. They hate to hear that. But it's the way it is. I mean, I've done, I don't know, I've done 10, 15 games in there. So I think I can say that, although this year, Jack and I went in there and there was 100, and of course, there's nobody there. I mean, Michigan was really locked down and we couldn't even go to a restaurant. Pre-game meal on Friday, the meal on Friday night was actually going to Hungry Howie's to get takeout pizza. And so we go in and Penn State's winning the game and there's nobody there. They have the cardboards, And so Penn State's driving to put the game away. And they're putting the game away. And I looked over at Jack, and this is on the broadcast. I said, well, this is so bad for Michigan today. I said, 2 of the cardboard cutouts just got up and left.
Do you think college football has a parity problem? I mean, Penn State famously in this college football playoff era has kind of been screwed over in terms of, the committee picking the final 4 teams. Do you think there's a problem with some of the bigger schools like a Alabama, like a Clemson, recruiting all the players? Or do you think it's kind of with the mindset, look, these are the great schools. They're going to continue to recruit the best players. It's up to schools like Penn State, like Virginia Tech to over-recruit them and overtake them eventually.
Well, I think you ask a great question, Billy, because it's interesting. In the NFL, if you have a lousy year, Jacksonville Jaguars, you get Trevor Lawrence. Okay? You're the New York Jets, you get Zach Wilson. In college football, and if you're obviously the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, you get the 32nd pick. Well, in college football, if you're Alabama, you get the best recruiting class. If you're Clemson, you get the best recruiting class. We just went through an NCAA basketball tournament where 68 teams are in, which is 19% of the teams eligible to be in the tournament. There's 357 teams. I think 353 are eligible for the tournament. 4 are still working their way in. So it's 19%. College football, the Final Four is made up of 3%, 4 of 130. I feel like I'm doing a math class here. And college basketball, when the tournament begins, every area of the country is represented. Every area is represented. Virginia Tech was in, right? Virginia was in, but so was Gonzaga, and so was UCLA, and so was Texas Southern. And you can go through every part of the country. They had teams in the tournament in every part of the country. And that does nothing except grow the game when that happens. This is where college football is missing a big element here. I realize that the contract is 7 years in, so they can't do anything about it yet. You can't just go to ESPN and say, hey, we're going to expand, give us more money. Well, ESPN's not going to give you more money. They have a contract that goes through 2025. So it's going to stay at least for the foreseeable future. But once the contract's available, they need to expand to at least 8 and maybe even 12. Why? To get more people into the game itself, to open up the gate to get more parts of the country in. The Pac-12, which did very well in the NCAA tournament, with Oregon State, USC, UCLA, Colorado. I mean, they did great. But you look at the Pac-12 in football, they've had 2 representatives. Washington was in 16, and it probably should have been Penn State, not Washington. But that's a different argument. The furthest west, year in and year out, that you get with the college football playoff is Norman, Oklahoma. This year, the furthest west was South Bend, Indiana. That's not good for the game. That doesn't grow the game across the country. So the idea is to grow the game. And if the NCAA basketball tournament can be 3 weekends, the college football tournament, which obviously brings with it a physicality, I think needs to be 3 weekends as well. Now, if you want it, that means 8. If you want to put an extra weekend in there somewhere, okay, and give some people some buys, okay. But you have to open up the door where the 5 Power 5 schools get automatics. And then a group of 5 team needs to get in at that point. Because there's always that thought process of, wow, Abilene Christian won. That's great for the NCAA tournament. Now, no offense, but let's take Oral Roberts. There is a point. I remember I was at the Florida Gulf Coast Georgetown game because it was in Philadelphia. So I was at the game, covering the game. And then they won. Everybody goes, oh my God, Florida Gulf Coast. Everybody thought they were community college. Okay. And then the next day, now I didn't go to the next round, but they beat San Diego State. Now they're in the Sweet 16. Now, no offense, at some point, Cinderella, like the luster wears off a little bit here. See, UCLA goes from first 4 to Final 4, but that's UCLA. All right. Oral Roberts, like, I don't want to see them anymore. Okay. But it's neat the first round. Well, it's the same thing here. What happens, like, for example, Central Florida's had some great teams. People would like to see, can they win? It's not just whether they can win a game. They can win a game. The question is, can they win 2? Then could they win 3? And I don't think they could. But it would be fun for everybody to see if they could. And I think you could then open up for 2 more at-large teams. You can get to 8. You just need to expand the pool. And part of that is take what the NCAA tournament does with automatic bids, with at-large bids, and expand the pool and make it more exciting. You already have New Year's 6 bowl games. Well, you can use the New Year's 6 bowl games as your playoff games. You already have the system in place. Use it. Because right now, college football, the TV ratings have stagnated for the championship game. Well, the reason it's stagnating is like, okay, it's great. It's going to be Clemson, Ohio State for the 12th straight year. Fabulous. Can't wait to watch. And all this stuff about, like it would take away from the regular season. Billy, no. We're getting the games in November now where people are essentially out of it. Expanding the pool actually keeps people in it and makes the games in November more meaningful.
Mr. Jones, you've been so gracious with your time. I have 2 final questions for you. My first one is, what's your advice to aspiring sportscasters trying to make it during this pandemic? I mean, you know better than anyone, it's already a competitive business. Now we have to deal with the realities of COVID. So what's your advice to young guys and girls like me who want to make it in this field?
Well, just always work. But don't give up on the dream. Don't be, you're going to have a lot of people tell you, Billy, and also other people that are watching this, that, well, it's a competitive field. You can't make it. Well, you know what? Obviously, somebody does. And that was my attitude way back when. Now we're going back, to the beginning of broadcasting here. Those games I did in the 1930s. But if I had $1 for every person that told me, well, I don't know, maybe you got to do something else. It's a hard field. And my attitude was, well, somebody's doing it, right? And so don't give up on it. In other words, don't get to be 30 or 35 and have regrets you didn't give it a shot, because all you have to do is convince somebody, right? I mean, you're going to get rejections, right? And you're going to get no's. Well, let the no's motivate you. And let the one person that tells you yes motivate you. And you constantly work to be better at your craft all the time. Make sure that you early on in your career develop a mentor along the way, somebody that can take you under their wing and show you how to go about things. I was so fortunate early in my career. Gil Santos, who did the Patriots for 40 years, there was a 4-year period of time where he was broadcasting Penn State football, and I was the third announcer. I felt like I was sitting there as the third guy in Beaver Stadium or in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, because we were doing Penn State games in Alabama at that time. That I felt like I was in a living play-by-play classroom. And then he'd say to me, hey, let me listen to your high school football tape. And he'd say, hey, I like this, I like that. Hey, tweak this a little bit, try that. There are things that today that he told me I'm still doing. So mentorship is really important. Internships are really important. A constant drive that, to get your foot in the door. And then once you get your foot in the door, never take your foot off the gas. And also try to always think a little bit outside the box. And the reason I tell my students in my broadcasting class, don't be the one that always goes after the low-hanging fruit story. Right? Now, sometimes you have to. Sometimes there's no doubt you have to do that. So look within and see if there's a better story someplace that nobody else is telling. When you interview somebody, ask questions. Don't make statements. Hey, Billy, great interview. And I'm expecting you to tell me, oh, thank you. Right? Instead of, Billy, what question? Why question? When you're doing something like that. Confidence is a big part of this. Don't ever let this shake your confidence. Whenever you're on the air, be confident. Right? And not only that, when you're in interviews, like being interviewed by somebody about getting a job, be confident. And above all, be yourself. Don't try to be somebody you're not. You're the best you there is. So since you're the best you there is, just be yourself. Right? Work ethic means everything. Mentorship means everything. But above all, being yourself is the whole ballgame.
My final question for you, Mr. Jones. I mean, you've been at Penn State for nearly 40 years. You call games for your alma mater, one of the best, in my opinion, college jobs in the country. As you reflect on your career, are you pretty content with how it's played out? I mean, is there something you wish you could have done? Or all being said, pretty happy where you're at calling games for Penn State?
Oh, I feel like I've had the best seat in the house here for 40 years. You just sit back and you feel fortunate. You get to do this. There's 7 billion people in the world. 65 of them get to call Power 5 football and basketball. Hey, so you sit there and go, wow, how fortunate am I? And what's really, I work with great people where I couldn't handpick better people to work with. And I'm talking, it's not just working with Jack Ham and Dick Girardi. It's working with an engineer like Bob Taylor, working with an engineer and director like Roger Corey, having a guy like Ron Mueller, who's one of our guys that helps out, up in the booth once in a while. Have people like that. I've always been surrounded by really great people. I've always had a burning desire to not just like, okay, I've done my chart a certain way. How do I make it better? I'm always trying to think of a way to make it better. But then you're sitting there and you're calling games on a Saturday with 110,000 people in Beaver Stadium, right? You're sitting at Rupp Arena on a Saturday night watching Penn State. I've only done one game there, but it was the night Penn State won. They beat Kentucky. 77-73 or some number like that, or 73-69, I think. And you're looking around, there's 22,000, 23,000 people there, and you're saying to yourself, I get to do this? You feel like every time you're doing it, you're living out, like the dream world. And so, you sit back and you reflect on it, and all you think about is how fortunate you happen to be that you're the one that gets to do this. Because obviously, if I were to tomorrow say, hey, I'm done, the line of people who would want the job would go from here to Philadelphia and might go all the way to the shore, because that's how badly people want this particular job. So you mentioned Joe Paterno earlier. He always had a saying, you either get better or you get worse. You never stay the same. So your goal has to be better every single day. And I've been fortunate. I've been allowed to try and get better every day at a job like this. You obviously have a tremendous play-by-play person at Virginia Tech. Tremendous. And so in our positions, we know how fortunate we are. And you don't take the job for 1 second for granted. The second you do that, you should get out, because, right? I know people don't go to malls anymore, right? But if this were an old mall, right? This is the candy store of the mall. This is the ice cream shop of the mall.
Mr. Jones, this has been such a pleasure getting to talk to you about your illustrious career at Penn State, all the great stories you have to share. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
No, Billy, it was my pleasure. I had a great time doing this. Thanks for inviting me.
That's Mr. Steve Jones, the longtime voice of the Penn State Nittany Lions. Nice enough to join me today on the latest edition of the Pulse with BP. Thanks to everybody for joining us, and Mr. Jones. We'll see you next time.